Harold never imagined that retirement could be this suffocating. When he packed up his life and left the traffic-choked streets of Atlanta behind, all he wanted was peace. Just peace. The kind that sits quietly on the surface of a still lake in the morning, where you can hear the chirping of birds instead of the blare of car horns. He found it, at least he thought he had, when he stumbled across a tucked-away community surrounding a glistening lake, wrapped in woods and whispering promises of rest. The homes were modest, the neighbors mostly older like himself, and the air smelled like pine and freedom. But within weeks of settling into his new home, the first crack in the dream appeared, not from nature, but from bureaucracy in pressed khakis and clipboards. A letter slid under his door accused him of disrupting community harmony by fishing off the lakeside dock behind his home. A fine followed, $600 for violating some HOA clause he never saw. Fishing. That's what they were fining him for. Harold stared at the notice like it had come from another planet. In his hands, the paper shook. Not from rage, but from something deeper. Something bruised. "How do you fine a man for trying to breathe?" he whispered to no one. The lake was the only place he spoke aloud to his late wife, Mary. Every morning, he cast his line and told her what he missed. How the coffee didn't taste the same without her hum in the kitchen. How the bed felt too wide. The lake was where he kept her memory alive. But now, some self-important committee had decided that his grief was against the rules. And that realization, that cruelty hidden in formality, was the first ember of a fire that Harold didn't know he was ready to light. He hadn't cried since Mary's funeral. Not during the sorting of her clothes, not during the long, aching nights where he reached across the bed and touched nothing. But that morning, standing barefoot on the wooden dock, citation notice in hand, he wept. Not because of the fine. Not even because of the insult. But because it was the first time someone had told him, indirectly but clearly, that his loss didn't matter. That his grief was too visible. Too messy. The dock was more than wood and nails. It was the last place he felt close to her. He remembered her laugh bouncing off the water, the way she used to dip her feet and scold him for using canned worms. And now, strangers who'd never known her, never known them, were telling him it was unsightly. Harold wasn't a fighter. He'd lived a quiet life, 20 years teaching woodworking, 3 decades of faithful marriage, and a retirement plan modest but enough. But he'd always believed in dignity, in being allowed to feel. And suddenly, that dignity was under attack. It hurt more than he expected, more than he thought he could bear. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, looking at Mary's photograph and whispering, "They want to erase you. Erase this." His hands trembled, but something else stirred beneath them, resolve. For the first time since her passing, Harold felt something stronger than grief. It was the undeniable, burning knowledge that being quiet hadn't protected him, that his silence had been mistaken for compliance. And as the tears dried on his face, a new decision formed in the stillness. If they wanted to challenge the worth of his memories, then they'd see just how much they meant to him. Not through anger, but through action. The next day, he walked down to the lake with his rod in hand, citations still tucked in his coat pocket. He fished, just as he had every day before. But this time, he didn't look over his shoulder. And when the HOA president Dolores, a sharp-faced woman with perfectly plucked eyebrows and an aura of untouchable control, stormed toward him from across the lawn with a clipboard and a righteous fury in her eyes, Harold didn't budge. "You were warned," she snapped, voice high and artificial. "This is your second violation." He looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'm not fishing for sport," he said. "I'm remembering someone I loved." She blinked, not expecting resistance, let alone such measured defiance. "That's not the issue here," she said. "It's about standards, Mr. Walton. The community aesthetic." Harold laughed, quietly, without joy. "You think grief is an aesthetic?" She didn't answer, just handed him another slip. "Another fine. You're not above the rules," she added. "No," Harold agreed. "But some rules shouldn't exist." The dock creaked beneath him as he turned his back on her and cast his line again. That was the moment the war began, not over money or docks or lakeside views, but over what it means to be human, over the right to mourn, to heal, and to exist in peace. From that moment, Harold wasn't just a retired teacher. He became, unknowingly, the challenger to a regime of silence and control disguised as order. And like every unexpected revolution, it began with a rod, a memory, and the refusal to look away. It was Ella who changed everything. She appeared one morning with a loaf of warm banana bread and eyes that had seen too much. I saw what they did to you, she said simply. They did it to me too. Harold didn't know how to respond at first. He'd kept his distance from most of the neighbors. Figured that was safest. But something in Ella's voice, low, raspy, and honest, cut through the usual dance of pleasantries. She sat with him on the porch, and for an hour, they didn't talk about the weather or politics or small things. They talked about loss. She'd lost her husband 10 years earlier to pancreatic cancer. Then she lost her land to pressure, pressured by the same HOA, backed into a corner with rising assessments and board votes that favored buyers connected to the president's husband. They wanted the land for a community garden, she said. Told me I was being selfish for holding on to it when it could serve everyone. So she sold. Cheap. And 3 months later, the garden was replaced by a private patio club, exclusive to board members and their guests. They think silence means surrender, she said, echoing Harold's own thoughts. But sometimes silence just means we haven't started yet. Her words ignited something in him. The loneliness he'd wrapped around himself like armor cracked. Someone else had suffered. And survived. Maybe together, they could do more than survive. Maybe they could push back, not with shouting, but with truth. Ella leaned forward, lowering her voice. There's something you should see. About that lake. What followed wasn't just information. It was revelation. They drove together to the county records office, 2 old souls dressed in flannel and denim, flipping through dusty folders like detectives uncovering buried crimes. There, in black and white, was the map. The lake, thought to be part of the HOA's property, was clearly bordered by a strip of private land. The name beside it? Ellen J. McCoy. Ella's full name. The paperwork was decades old, left unchallenged and unnoticed. The tract of land behind Harold's home, including part of the dock, still legally hers. They never transferred it properly, the clerk said, flipping through the yellowed deeds. That HOA's been using it, but it's not theirs. Harold stared at the map, heartbeat steady but rising. The land had never belonged to them. All those fines, all that pressure, it was built on nothing but assumption and intimidation. Ella exhaled slowly, the weight of years lifting from her shoulders. They wanted to erase me, she said. But they forgot I kept the originals. That night, as crickets sang and moonlight touched the lake, Harold and Ella sat on the porch with 2 mugs of tea and a plan forming between them. Not revenge. Not even justice, at first. Just reclamation. Reclaiming the space, the silence, the memories that had been stolen under the guise of community management. And as the stars spread above them, Harold felt something he hadn't in months. Purpose. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of his peace, but the start of truly earning it. The crisp edge of late autumn settled over the town the day Harold and Ella stepped into the cramped office of a retired circuit court judge who spent his twilight years surrounded by casebooks and the steady tick of a grandfather clock. The place smelled of leather and wisdom, and on that ordinary morning it became the backdrop for a revelation that would forever redraw the lines of power in their lakeside community. The judge, a stooped man whose voice still carried the resonance of decades behind a bench, studied the property documents with a furrowed brow, then raised his gaze, eyes shining with something between astonishment and delight. You understand what you're holding? He asked, his tone gentle but charged. Ella nodded, though a tremor in her hands betrayed the enormity of the moment. Harold watched the confidence return to her shoulders as the judge traced a faded boundary with an arthritic finger and declared, in words as steady as a gavel, that the homeowners board had absolutely no authority over the tract hugging the lake. It was as if years of quiet injustice were being peeled away, layer by layer, revealing bedrock truth. The lakefront the HOA lorded over was never theirs. Harold felt Mary's presence in that room, felt her approving smile, because the decision upheld something she'd always believed. Dignity begins with knowing where you stand. Walking out into the chilly sunlight, files clutched to Harold's chest like a shield. They understood this wasn't just a loophole. It was a turning point. Proof that bullies thrive only when good people trust them blindly. For the first time since receiving that first citation, Harold's heart beat not with grief, but with ready determination. The kind a man finds when he realizes he still has chapters left to write. Back at Ella's kitchen table, steam from freshly brewed coffee curled between them as they calculated risks and possibilities. Ella confessed the land still carried the ghosts of her late husband's dreams. A place he'd hoped to plant fruit trees and grandkids' memories. Dreams bulldozed by HOA pressure and her own fatigue. Selling it outright felt like losing him all over again. Harold reached for her hand, the same steady grip he'd offered students learning to carve dovetails, and suggested something that startled them both with its simplicity: partnership. What if, instead of surrendering the land to outsiders again, they became stewards together? What if her husband's dream and Harold's grief could share the same shore? Ella hesitated, not out of doubt in Harold, but out of fear. Fear the board would retaliate, smear her as they had smeared him. Yet when she looked into Harold's weathered eyes, she saw an anchor, not a gamble. They calculated the purchase price to cover her long-deferred hip surgery and leave enough for a modest trust in her grandchildren's names. Harold crunched numbers against his pension, and the nest egg Mary had insisted they save for living, not just surviving. Signing the paperwork was more than a transaction. It felt like planting a flag of hope in ground once salted by defeat. That night, while foxes barked in distant woods and the lake shimmered under a hunter's moon, Harold slipped the new deed into a wooden box he'd built the day after Mary died. A box meant for things worth carrying into tomorrow. He closed the lid with reverence, whispering, "We're taking it back, love. All of it." Dolores reacted exactly as Harold expected, with a storm of polite-sounding malice. Letters multiplied in his mailbox like invasive weeds. Citations for imagined violations, warnings about unapproved exterior lighting. His porch bulb had burned out and been replaced at identical wattage. Accusations that his presence lowered home values. Neighbors he'd greeted warmly now crossed the street to avoid his eyes, coached by whispered gossip that he was unstable, maybe dangerous. Social media threads bloomed overnight. Anonymous posts painting him as a bitter widower intent on ruining community spirit. Ella warned him Dolores was calling in favors at City Hall, hinting Harold's dock might violate shoreline ordinances. Each lie left a bruise, yet Harold found that inside every attempt to isolate him, the bond with Ella, and with his own conscience, only strengthened. He responded not with counterattacks, but with unwavering calm, mowing his lawn exactly to regulation height, waving to every passerby, spending evenings on the dock talking softly to Mary about courage disguised as kindness. The board could fabricate infractions, but they could not fabricate character. He learned day by day the quiet power of consistency, that holding one's ground with grace unsettles tyrants more than shouting ever could. Beneath Dolores's escalating fury, Harold recognized fear. The fear of someone who senses her empire of intimidation is cracking, but cannot admit it. And that revelation tasted sweeter than any formal victory, because it meant the battle was already half won. 7 dawns after the deed transfer, Harold hammered sturdy cedar posts into the soil at measured intervals around his newly claimed perimeter. Each post supported a simple wooden sign, hand-routed in his garage shop. Private property, ecological restoration in progress. No threats, no venom, just a statement of fact and purpose. By mid-morning, Dolores arrived, flanked by 2 board members wielding smartphones like swords. Cameras recorded as she screeched that he was blocking shared amenities and violating clauses she couldn't quite quote. Harold, dressed in worn jeans and Mary's favorite flannel, recited the parcel number and deed date calmly enough to chill the summer air. He pointed to the judge's notarized opinion attached to the fence and invited them to verify it at the clerk's office. When Dolores threatened lawsuits that would strip him of every penny, Harold simply responded, "Truth doesn't fear courtrooms." Those 5 words rippled through the gathered onlookers. Neighbors drawn by the commotion, because they carried no arrogance, only certainty. That night, as wind sent ripples across the moonlit lake, Harold sat on the dock and felt something new: ownership of his own story. The shore was quiet. The stars looked brighter. He realized boundaries, clearly drawn and respectfully enforced, are not walls but invitations. To integrity, to respect, to a kind of peace that can't be legislated by committees. The upheaval that followed shook the neighborhood like a sudden thaw after a long freeze. Conversations once confined to whispers over hedges spilled into driveways and living rooms. Couples who'd never missed a board meeting asked, in hushed outrage, why their fees kept rising while the clubhouse roof still leaked. Grandparents who donated to lakeside improvement funds demanded receipts and explanations. At the next monthly gathering, folding chairs filled every corner of the rec hall, the air thick with questions Dolores could no longer parry with pastel-colored pie charts. Richard, the treasurer whose signature adorned every suspicious expenditure, stammered through a financial report riddled with miscellaneous services and consulting expenses that matched the name of Dolores's sister-in-law. When an elderly resident in the front row, eyes watery with betrayal, Asked if the board had ever confirmed land ownership before spending dues on shoreline maintenance. Silence fell so heavy it felt like a verdict. Harold sat in the back, hands clasped, saying nothing. He didn't need to. Truth had taken on a life of its own, spreading from neighbor to neighbor like dawn light across water. It dawned on them that the real crime wasn't Harold's fishing rod or Ella's stubborn grace. It was the slow erosion of community trust, orchestrated by people who confused authority with entitlement. As residents filed out, murmuring about audits and special elections, Harold rose and stepped into the crisp night air, feeling the neighborhood exhale, beginning, at last, to breathe something cleaner than fear. There's a special kind of satisfaction in standing on your own soil, not just legally, but spiritually. The morning after the crowd began whispering about missing funds and dubious decisions, Harold stood at the edge of his newly acquired property with a cup of hot coffee and watched the mist roll off the lake like the last breath of a bad dream. The trail that wound from the old boat ramp to the tall oak, once touted by the HOA as a community wellness path, was empty. For years, it had hosted strollers and joggers, each footstep unknowingly trespassing. But now it belonged to him. Not just because of Ella's signature or the judge's declaration, but because of something deeper. A sense that, finally, the earth beneath his feet respected his presence. That afternoon, he took out the plans he'd drafted the night before. Meticulously drawn diagrams with labeled garden beds, shaded benches, and birdhouses hand-carved in his workshop. He wasn't interested in revenge. What Harold wanted was renewal. Not to exclude, but to preserve. Not to punish, but to redefine. He marked off a section to be left wild, a haven for deer and foxes. Another part he sketched as a meditation grove with native trees and a plaque that would honor Mary. Not just as his wife, but as the gentle soul who taught him that kindness is not weakness. And as the sun dipped low, bathing the trail in gold, he made a quiet vow. This land wouldn't be a battleground anymore. It would be a sanctuary, for those who respected it, for those who'd been silenced, for those who, like him, simply wanted to belong. The HOA, predictably, didn't go quiet. When power slips from the fingers of those who wield it selfishly, desperation replaces dignity. Dolores doubled down, calling emergency board meetings, issuing press releases to local newsletters, and even staging photo ops with residents holding "Protect Our Trails" signs in neatly staged lines. But Harold had already learned that when someone fears losing control, they often reveal who they truly are. He kept his distance, not out of fear but strategy. He'd come to understand that dignity isn't proven through shouting, it's proven through patience. Meanwhile, the harassment intensified. Overnight, someone spray-painted "Selfish Old Man" on his mailbox. 2 of the new wooden signs he installed were ripped from the ground. And one morning, he woke to find a dead fish nailed to his front door, some grotesque message meant to mock his connection to the lake. But Harold, seasoned by years of grief and quiet fortitude, didn't flinch. He simply took photos, logged the incidents, and added them to a growing folder titled Evidence, HOA Intimidation. And he wasn't alone. Ella, who had once preferred to stay invisible, began attending board meetings again. She wore her late husband's veteran's pin on her blouse and took notes, detailed, meticulous notes. Their quiet strength drew others, a retired nurse, a widowed piano teacher, a Vietnam vet who hadn't spoken at meetings in a decade. They didn't speak loudly, but they listened with intention. And slowly, the tide began to turn. Not through outrage, but through truth. A truth that grew roots in whispered hallway conversations, in exchanged glances, in brave nods across the lawn. The revolution wasn't loud. It was deliberate. It was Harold's idea to walk into City Hall with Ella and request public access to the development permits submitted by the HOA over the past 5 years. They had no legal training, just curiosity and a growing suspicion that something rotten lay beneath the HOA's polished surface. What they found there made Harold's hands go cold. Permit applications had been filed to expand a community green zone and nature education pavilion along the same lakefront path he now owned. Applications submitted under the HOA's name, but without Ella's signature or knowledge, even though she was the registered owner at the time. Worse, the designs were drawn up by a company called Redwood Planning Partners. A quick online search revealed something infuriating. The business was operated by Dolores's niece. It wasn't just arrogance. It was theft wrapped in red tape. They had never planned to ask permission. They assumed no one would challenge them. Armed with this knowledge, Harold called a local environmental attorney recommended by Ella's friend from church. The lawyer, a soft-spoken woman with fire in her eyes, reviewed everything and leaned forward across her desk. "They've overreached," she said. "Big time. If you want to fight this, you've got the law on your side. But more importantly, you've got the story. People will listen to you." That was the moment Harold understood the depth of what had been done, not just to him and Ella, but to the whole community. For years, they'd been ruled by a system where power hid behind procedure, where charm disguised coercion. But now he held the thread, and if he pulled it hard enough, the whole thing would unravel. And unravel it did. The HOA's next fundraiser was meant to be their crowning event, a lakeside gala complete with catered hors d'oeuvres, a silent auction, and string lights hanging between trees Harold now legally owned. The invitations went out, and the words "Green Zone Expansion Project" were printed in bold at the top. Harold received his copy too, delivered by mistake to his mailbox by a red-faced postal worker who whispered, "I think they forgot whose land they're throwing a party on." Harold tucked the invite into his evidence folder and did something he hadn't done in years. He bought a new blazer, ironed his slacks, and arrived at the event not as a protester, but as the landowner. Cameras flashed as Dolores took the stage to welcome donors. Just as she raised her champagne glass to make a toast, Harold stepped forward, holding up a simple manila envelope. "I'm going to have to ask everyone to leave," he said evenly. "This land is private property, and none of you have permission to be here." Silence fell. Dolores laughed nervously, tried to wave it off. "He's joking," she said. "Everyone knows this is common space." Harold handed her the envelope. Inside was a copy of the deed, certified. Attached was a cease and desist letter drafted by his attorney. "Your permits were filed fraudulently," he added. "And if anyone here has made a donation, I recommend asking for a receipt. Because this event is illegal." The crowd murmured. Then it moved. One by one, guests stepped back. Some gave Harold apologetic nods. Others looked at Dolores like they were seeing her for the first time. The gala collapsed like a house of cards. And as the last string light was unplugged, Harold turned toward the lake, quiet again. His lake. His peace. But he wasn't finished. Power doesn't just fall. It has to be replaced. The next day, Harold and Ella sat at the community center with a box of flyers, organizing an open forum titled, "A Conversation About Truth." It wasn't about accusations. It was about accountability. Dozens of residents came, some angry, some confused, but most just tired of being told what to think. Harold stood at the front of the room and told his story, plain and direct. He showed documents, receipts, maps. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Truth is loud on its own. When he finished, Ella stood beside him and said something that silenced the room. "They called me selfish for holding on to my land. But the truth is, I gave up too much. And I'm not going to be silent anymore." Applause broke out, not thunderous, but honest. It was enough. That night, residents began knocking on Harold's door, not to scold, but to thank. A woman offered to help plant wildflowers near the trailhead. A teenager asked if he could help build benches as part of his Eagle Scout project. And an old man with Parkinson's left a note on Harold's porch that simply read, "You reminded us that dignity isn't optional. Thank you." In the end, Harold didn't just reclaim the land. He reclaimed the soul of a neighborhood that had forgotten its own strength. Not with protests, not with lawsuits, but with quiet, relentless truth. Harold had expected retaliation, but what he didn't expect was how organized, how methodical the smear campaign would be. In less than a week, his name was whispered with suspicion. Neighbors who once waved now looked away. A local newsletter suddenly featured a letter from a concerned resident warning about individuals with questionable legal tactics threatening neighborhood unity. Posters began appearing in the community center. Asterisk community over conflict. Asterisk with no names, but everyone knew who they were aimed at. But the worst blow came when Ella's granddaughter came home from school in tears. "They said Nana's a thief," she sobbed. That was the moment Harold knew this had gone far beyond rules or regulations. This was a campaign to erase character. But he didn't bend. Instead, he sharpened his focus. Working quietly with his attorney, he began gathering financial records tied to HOA spending. He requested minutes from the last 3 years of board meetings. When those requests were denied, he filed under the state's Open Records Act. At night, he and Ella sat with coffee and highlighters, poring over spreadsheets riddled with vague expenses and questionable reimbursements. And soon, the truth began to reveal itself, like a faint shape emerging through fog. Thousands of dollars funneled into consulting services by a firm with ties to Dolores's cousin. Event costs with no vendor receipts. Trail maintenance paid to a business that didn't exist on any state registry. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, disguised by jargon and complexity. But Harold had learned that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through balance sheets. And in those whispers, he found not just evidence, but clarity. This wasn't about him. It was about stopping something that had been hurting people long before he arrived. What came next changed everything. Harold sat down with a local journalist, an older woman named Janet who had worked for the county paper for over 30 years. She listened with the quiet patience of someone who had seen power corrupted before. When Harold slid the folder across her table, photos, financial records, letters, her expression barely changed, except for one quiet murmur. They thought no one was watching. Within 2 days, an article hit the front page. Asterisk, HOA under fire for fraud allegations. Asterisk names were printed. Donations mentioned. The community exploded. A neighborhood once lulled into complacency now found itself awake and angry. Residents who had once blindly written checks now wanted answers. A man who had donated $5,000 for a supposed trail beautification fund demanded a full audit. And perhaps most astonishingly, the treasurer, previously silent Richard, publicly stepped forward and confessed that he had been pressured into signing off on expenses he didn't fully understand. But the most powerful moment came at the next emergency HOA meeting. Dolores stood, flanked by her usual inner circle, trying to calm the crowd. But the moment she began speaking, something shifted. Hands shot up. Voices refused to be silenced. "Where's the money?" someone demanded. "Why weren't we told the land didn't belong to us?" another shouted. And then, from the back of the room, Ella rose. Her voice, clear but shaking, carried across the room. "You called me selfish when I asked questions. You told me to stay quiet. But I've learned that silence only protects the wrong people." The room went still. In that breathless pause, the illusion of control shattered. Dolores stammered, deflecting. But it was too late. The neighborhood had found its voice, and Harold had lit the match. What followed was swift and irreversible. A formal motion was introduced to remove the entire HOA board. Emergency elections were scheduled. Investigations began. But Harold didn't gloat. Instead, he kept building. The land he had fought so hard for was beginning to bloom. The benches were installed. A small wooden bridge was completed over the narrowest bend in the lake. A trail was carved carefully with volunteer help, winding under the trees and leading to a clearing where Harold placed a memorial plaque, in honor of those who came before and those brave enough to protect what they loved. One by one, neighbors who had once avoided him began to walk the trail. Some brought their children. Others brought apologies. One elderly woman simply handed him a folded paper with 2 words. "Thank you." Ella's family hosted a picnic there one Sunday, inviting anyone who wanted to come. Dozens showed up, bringing pies, casseroles, laughter. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a return. The land wasn't just reclaimed. It was reborn. And in its quiet beauty, Harold saw something sacred, healing. The trail wasn't paved with revenge. It was paved with integrity, with the idea that right matters more than rules. And that sometimes the simplest act, planting a flower, building a bench, offering forgiveness, can change the soul of an entire neighborhood. It didn't take long for justice to catch up with the past. By the end of the summer, the county issued official charges against several former board members. Fraud, misappropriation of funds, abuse of authority. Dolores, once untouchable in her tailored suits and artificial smiles, was photographed leaving the courthouse in handcuffs. Her carefully curated legacy crumbled. And yet Harold didn't cheer. He simply watched, hands folded, and said quietly to Ella, she could have built something real. That same week, the HOA voted unanimously to rename the trail the Ella and Harold Community Path. The plaque was updated. Photos of its opening appeared in the local news, not as scandal, but as celebration. And then something unexpected happened. A group of high school students, inspired by the story, began a volunteer project to expand the trail into an educational wildlife walk. Harold helped them install signs teaching about native plants, conservation, and stewardship. The first sign read, "Asterisk respect is not given by title. It is earned by action." Asterisk residents who had once feared conflict now participated in dialogue, budget reviews, open votes. The HOA didn't disappear. It evolved. It became what it should have always been, a support, not a weapon. And Harold? He kept fishing, kept talking to Mary, kept fixing broken boards, and smiling at the sound of children's laughter echoing off the lake. Peace had returned, not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind born from standing firm. Years passed and seasons changed. The lake remained still. The trail grew greener. And one cool fall afternoon, Harold received a letter in the mail. It was from a nearby town's civic council, inviting him to speak at a community leadership event. Your story, it read, has inspired us to examine our own structure. We'd be honored if you'd share your journey. Harold read the letter twice, then set it down beside Mary's photo. He whispered, "Can you believe it?" And for a moment, he imagined her nodding, smiling that proud smile she always wore when he helped others. He sat down at his desk and began to write. Not just a speech, a legacy, a record of what happens when someone ordinary decides that they, and the people around them, deserve something better. And perhaps more importantly, that no amount of intimidation, manipulation, or silence could ever erase the power of truth. That's the real ending. Not revenge, not courtrooms or signatures. But this, a man who found peace by protecting it. A woman who reclaimed what was hers with grace. And a community that learned the hard way that sometimes the quiet ones are the strongest. Because when they speak, they don't just make noise. They make change.